A gente vai dar início a uma conversa com o professor Edward Alpers. O professor Alpers é professor emérito da Universidade da Califórnia, UCLA, e obteve o seu PhD na School of Oriental and African Studies, da Universidade de Londres, em 1966. Lecionou em universidades na África, especialmente na Somália e na Tanzânia, e tem realizado pesquisas em arquivos de diferentes países africanos, inclusive em Moçambique, nos arquivos, principalmente nos arquivos sobre o norte de Moçambique, Cabo Delgado. Tem uma larga experiência de ensino, principalmente na UCLA, tendo orientado cerca de 62 teses de PhD, entre as teses, historiadores que são bastante conhecidos do público brasileiro, John Thornton, Roquinaldo Ferreira, José Curto, que é um historiador português e português-canadense, né? Kathleen Sheldon, que é uma historiadora na linha dos estudos femininos, dos estudos sobre a mulher, né? Tem vários e numerosos artigos e obras e publicações e livros. Então, a grande temática do professor Alpers é exatamente a história desse mundo índico, né? Nas várias faces do mundo índico. Então, para nós é um prazer ter o professor conosco e é isso. Parte das suas publicações estão disponíveis na página da Academia Edu. E agradecendo muitíssimo a presença, já agradeci 1000 vezes, vou ter que agradecer, mas dessa vez muito obrigado por estar conosco aqui.
Muito prazer.
Bem, boa tarde. Só complementando um pouco a apresentação da professora, queria deixar registrado aqui que foi um texto do professor Ned, o Mozambicans, Another Dimension of Africa Diaspora, que foi decisivo na nossa formação, né, Ivana? Eu acho que quando eu e Ivana começamos a estudar Moçambique aqui no departamento, não era uma área estudada e aquele texto, de repente, nos pareceu muito pertinente, né? Sair do Angola, Congo e olhar para o outro flanco do continente. E ele está sendo traduzido pela Elisângela, que vai ser publicado no nosso livro. E acho que é um texto que se torna clássico para os estudos africanos no Brasil, justamente pela agenda que ele propõe, né? Por ser programático no sentido de olhar para esse mundo índico, para essas ligações com Moçambique, que de fato não foi por onde começamos nos estudos sobre a África aqui no país. A minha primeira pergunta, professor, eu li, não me lembro onde exatamente, alguma entrevista que o senhor deu recentemente, que o senhor se envolveu no movimento de direitos civis. Então eu gostaria que o senhor falasse um pouco mais sobre isso, como isso aconteceu exatamente. Back in the early 60s, if I'm right. E que tipo de suporte, que tipo de apoio um homem branco podia dar ao movimento naquela época, e o que a sua família, seus amigos acharam disso, desse envolvimento?
Muito obrigado. So when I'm formed, my political formation and my cultural orientation towards things African both date to 1954. The one has to do with early rhythm and blues, rock and roll. so Música África. But the other has to do with Brown and the Board of Education versus the Board of Education, which in the United States is the major piece of federal legislation that basically said that separate but equal was not possible. You had to integrate. So I was 13 years old then, but it affected me. So when I got to college, I entered college in 1959. I was undergraduate at Harvard. And my friends were mainly, people on the left, as much as the left there was at Harvard in 1959, and some of my teachers. And so and one of them was particularly from an old left-wing family, one of my colleagues, one of my fellow freshmen. Anyway, we would go and picket Woolworths, which is the chain of what were called five and dime stores, and because the lunch counters that they had in the North were integrated, but they were not yet integrated in the South, so we would picket them. It was right by Boston Commons, right at the bottom of Boston Commons. We'd be out there picketing, and that was just my first taste of doing that. In high school, high school was just high school, nothing serious in those days, and so it really happened because of the context and the friends that I made, and I had a couple of African American friends, a group of us that were sort of in two-corner suites in our freshman dormitory, and I just kept doing that as much as I could. There was, we didn't. I think it's a problem actually for a lot of progressive or liberal white Americans of my generation to say that they were really active in the civil rights era. Because who can check? So they feel good for doing it. It's selective memory. So I did some stuff. What was important about that is that set me up later for much more engagement in things like liberation support movements and working both in Africa and then when I came back to the United States. So anyway, it was the right thing to do. It was better than not studying, which I was also pretty good at. My freshman year, I was pre-medical and didn't want to go. Both my parents are doctors, and one brother. So I was started out that way, and my family. I was at college, so they really didn't know what I was doing. But they would have been they were perfectly happy with this. They were progressive. I mean, they were Roosevelt Democrats was what we called them. So they were in favor of all of these things. So that was not a problem. So there's never any issues. And I did have some black friends, and they were involved in the same stuff. But that's what it was. I mean, it was a first taste of what it meant to do something other than say, "Oh, that's very bad." Mm-hmm. To actually get out, go from Cambridge, get in the subway, go into Boston, which meant I had to pay money to go in, pick up a sign, and stand out in the public and do something. I mean, and I'd never done that before, so that was important. Well, then actually the next step actually is the question you were going to ask about how I got involved with African history. So I was taking, biology 1 and chemistry, and I hated them. I mean, and I wasn't interested. So, but my studies got a little better my second year. In my third year, so what's called your junior year, for the first time, Harvard had somebody teaching African history. So for the first time, I remember very vividly coming back after the summer. I'd been a counselor at a summer camp. And coming back and seeing what courses there were, I said, "Oh, a course on African history." I knew nothing about it. I mean, I knew National Geographic. That's what people knew. And I went into the Department of History office, which I vaguely remember, and said, "Do you think I could focus, do a field in African history?" Because you had to do, typical history degree, you had to do some. And they said, "Yes." I said, "Do you think I could do my senior thesis?" I mean, I don't know where this came from. Could do my senior thesis. They said, "Well, go talk to this new professor, young professor, Robert Rothberg." So I did, and that was it. Now I can look back and say I was interested in black culture. I was interested in the civil rights movement. This is 1961. Africa. This is the year of the year after the year of Africa, and I never had any. None of this was conscious. It was really just a felt. You could even say emotional, I suppose. And I've told my undergraduate students for the next 45 or 50 years, I said, you shouldn't be doing anything unless you really care about it. If it feels right, do it, because that's what I did. So those first civil rights things and my general vaguely liberal, I wouldn't even say left, liberal politics, when Africa was offered, I said, oh, let's do that. And then I had two courses. I had a survey course and what was called junior tutorial, where you read. In those days, there wasn't much to read. So I had read things like Delafoss's Au Senegal, Niger. I mean, these big 19th century colonial volumes on African history. But I read all that stuff. And I had a course in African anthropology, in African economics, in African politics, and probably some course in European history, and that was it. So the whole year was Africa. And I decided to do a senior thesis, and the next year I took the other courses I had to get rid of. Actually, I took a course in English literature for a year, a course in Russian literature, finished one history course, and wrote my senior thesis. And doing that was then exciting because it was my first chance to do original research. And I actually did research in the Library of Congress on the papers of this American who had gone to Africa. He was the second European to go to the court of Mutesa of Buganda. And I wrote about him, and I used my French too. He was a francophile, so I could use my French as well. And I ended up getting my first article out of my senior thesis the summer after I graduated, and had decided at that point it was accepted at SOAS in London. I finished revising it, took some of the chapters, and it was published in the Uganda Journal in 1965. So Harvard was the best thing about Harvard, and since you know my wife, the best thing about Harvard was sitting next to my future wife the first day of the first class, 9 o'clock on a Monday morning.
Wow.
in the first meeting of French.
The first person knows.
And we got married the day after we graduated. She graduated from Radcliffe still on Wednesday. I graduated from Harvard on Thursday and got married on Friday. So that was the best part. But this other stuff was pretty good too. So I had really, and what doing the research did was convinced me that that's what I wanted to do. And it was interesting because Harvard had these few courses, but at one point, probably my senior year, Professor Rotberg had another student who came along who became she died a number of years ago, a very fine Middle Eastern historian. She eventually studied Arabic and wrote about the Middle East, but she was his second student in doing African history. And she and another woman, who became a very well-known psychologist, we said, we'd like to learn an African language. Can we go to Boston University, which has one of the older African studies programs, and study Swahili? It's Boston University. It's not Harvard. So there were some disadvantages. And of course, the other thing is Widener Library was a fantastic library, so I had amazing stuff I could do. So it was good in lots of ways, and basically the freedom to do what I wanted to, and I had good guidance. So that was that part of it. Harvard, as I said, had one course of each. They didn't actually have anybody doing anthropology, but Elizabeth Colson, who was one of the really great anthropologists of her generation, was then teaching at Brandeis University, and she taught the one course I took, and it's all I ever needed to know about anthropology. I mean, she was just fantastic. taught me how to read anthropology. Then she went to Berkeley, and she was at Berkeley for the next 35 years. So as I said, it was a good place to be. You really feel, at least you felt then, that you were, I felt I was, on the march, on the road to something new and exciting. And so where do you apply to graduate school in 1963? I applied to UCLA, which had started an African history program, and Wisconsin, where Philip Curtin and Jan van Sina were. But my advisor had done a DPhil at Oxford, and he said, you really should apply to SOAS. That's where it's really happening. Roland Oliver's just founded the Journal of African History and all of this. So I did, and I was accepted, and that's where we went. And that was a great place to be, because in those days, not only I had to take courses. It was one of these funny things. I had to take courses in African history for one term, while they figured out if my magna cum laude from Harvard was good enough for them. So they decided I could do it, and so then I was in the PhD program. But there's the SOAS library, which was not as good then as it is now, but it was very fine. 2 blocks away, the British Museum, which was then the British Library too, which also has an amazing manuscript, a lot of manuscript stuff, with additional manuscripts. And what's now the National Archives are now in Kew, which is an hour ride by the Central Line away. But in those days, the Public Record Office was in High Holborn. It was a 15-minute walk. So everything was right there. You could just, today I'll go there. And it was an amazing place to do research. So, once you get past having to do any coursework, it's just a research degree. And then in the summer of '64, we went to Lisbon, spent a little time in Paris, and then from, I guess, June or whenever the term ends, and I can never remember, in London, end of May, whatever. Then we went to Lisbon. We were there until into January of '66. Came back through Paris and spent 4 or 5 weeks working in the Archives Nationales. And again, that was convenient because the Aix-en-Provence archives didn't exist then. So everything was in Paris. The Bibliothèque Nationale, the Archives Nationales, Quai d'Orsay, all of the things that you would want were right there. And then back to London, where I get, and I've got, I think, 2 chapters out of 5 drafted. And I've already got a job in Tanzania. I come back, I get, this is how it worked in the old days, what's called the Old Boys Network, and it was old boys. Shula Marx was one of my colleagues as a student, and Shula said, you could just move ahead. She said, I'm a colonial and I'm a woman. So you had a hard, she was brilliant historian. But so the Dar es Salaam job I got because Terry Ranger was building the Dar es Salaam department after he was kicked out of, it's called PI, prohibited immigrant, thrown out of Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia. He put together this department, and most of them were from Oxford or Cambridge. And Roland Oliver clearly wanted to get some SOAS people. So both Walter Rodney and I were pushed for jobs. They were hiring by areas of expertise. So Walter for West to be the West Africanist. I was being pushed for the sort of Swahili and Portuguese. Nobody else had worked with Portuguese sources. So I went. Terry came to London. You had to go through what was called the Inter-University Council. So you applied through a kind of an intergovernmental thing. But Terry came up, and Roland and took me out with Terry to have a beer. And we talked, and I told him what I was doing, and he end of story. I get the job. And I think I'd have to look. That may have been in '65, before we went back to Lisbon. I'm not sure. But I come back, And I remember. Then I walk into every Wednesday there was a seminar in African history that Roland Oliver ran at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, which is just around the corner in Russell Square from SOAS. And I walk in and I say hello. I didn't call Roland Oliver Roland then. I called him Professor Oliver. And he says hello, and he leans into me and he says, "We're pushing you for Los Angeles." And I had to sit through a seminar, which was a seminar by Nehemiah Lefzion, the great Israeli Islamist. And I had to sit there and think, what's going on here? Well, I actually sort of knew, in a way, because Gervais Matthew, who was the co-editor of the first volume of the Oxford History of East Africa with Oliver, was scheduled to go to UCLA to teach in 1965, maybe the spring, and he got ill. He was a funny guy, and he got ill, and they said, "Well, we have this young American who could take his place." Well, I would have been in my second year of graduate school, 24 years old, to go off with people, and there were people like Martin Legassic, who was one of the graduate students, and I don't know if you know, Legassic became one of the chief theoreticians of the ANC military, and a brilliant historian. There was I think I would have been eaten alive, and fortunately, he was a Dominican. Father Matthew got well, but I knew that UCLA was starting to think about something like this. And my mentor, Richard Gray, who was a wonderful mentor, he had been a visitor at UCLA, or was going to. So when I heard this, I thought, I wonder. So then Leonard Thompson, who was building the UCLA program before he went off to Yale to found their Southern African program, Leonard came, and then Richard Gray and I went out and had a beer with Leonard. End of story. So here I had eventually have all these 62 graduate students, most of whom wanted academic jobs. Not all of them, but most of whom did. And I would tell them, I said, I had 2 contracts signed before I defended my thesis. And UCLA gave me 2 years of leave of absence because I hadn't set foot in Africa. It was a library district. And I said, I know what it's like to look for a job, and I know how to help you get a job, but I have no idea what your experience is going to be like. Because I didn't. I'd never been. It was the Old Boys Network. I was the first American at SOAS to finish a PhD, so I was kind of in a unique position. So I went to Dar es Salaam, and then I went to UCLA, and never moved after that. I moved back and forth, but so it was. So my career trajectory, which I'm just sort of following the questions, was really interesting. So I was very lucky, obviously. I mean, both Walter and I had not been to Africa because, you worked in the we were working in the Portuguese archives. Other people, and we were both colonials in that sense. Shula may have been a colonial, but she was South African, so that was not a problem. People like David Birmingham was his father was a very great economist, Walter Birmingham, and he'd been raised in Ghana. So, he knew a lot about Africa. And I'm trying to think of other people. And they'd all, they were Brits. They'd either done their national service in the army, or they were missionary. Their parents were missionaries, and we were, we'd never set foot in Africa. So for both of us, it was really important. I know it was for me. And then it was Tanzania in 1963. It was unbelievably exciting. It wasn't yet socialist, not that it ever was, but it was progressive, and Nyerere was an attractive figure, and Tanzania after Ghana and the fall of Nkrumah, Tanzania is where everybody anybody on the left wanted to go. So I met a number of African Americans, all kinds of people who'd been in Ghana and then left after after Nkrumah's fall, came to Dar es Salaam. So it was, and so Dar, so it was the university, which was exciting and building, and really an intellectual ferment of terrific minds: John Iliff, John McCracken, John Lonsdale, Terry Ranger, Walter, John Saul, Giovanni Arrighi. I mean, Arrighi's one of the great economic thinkers of the 20th century. It was fantastic, and there are lots of other people. And I was, 25 and had just finished, and still very much being formed intellectually. But there were a lot of serious Marxists there then. I know this is not a good word these days, and I was very much influenced by this. We read seriously. There were seminars all the time, and the seminars had everybody in them. The historians, the political scientists, the sociologists, and our students were really exciting. The students, including the most interesting students in many ways, were from Kenya and Uganda, like Museveni, who was my student, who I taught once. I mean, I wish he'd stepped down from being president about 20 years ago, but these were smart guys, and they were in Tanzania rather than at Makerere or Nairobi, precisely because Tanzania was exciting politically and a little more on the left. So we had really interesting students, and then people coming through all the time. The other thing, then, which was both political, but also people at the university, is the whole liberation of Southern Africa. So all the liberation movements had either their headquarters in Dar, or were important. Like the ANC was basically in Lusaka, but Dar was the huge thing. So you'd go to, see people at seminars, or you'd go to parties, or somebody like John Saul, who was really engaged with all of them as an academic, as a scholar. You just met all of them. I remember walking into the Frelimo, and this is after I met Mondlane, but walking into the Frelimo headquarters, which was then on Independence Avenue, which I think is Samora Machel Avenue now in Dar. Then walking in, there's Chisana, who's about a half year older than I am. We were both young guys. We were 25, 26 years old. Talk with him and say, "What are you doing?" And and it was like that. The way I got to connect with Frelimo, and I've told this story many times now, but it's a funny story. So there was an Ismaili greengrocer who specialized in high quality stuff, but specialized in the Europeans, the Wazungu, whether they were international, people or teaching at the university. We would go to the market too, but he had very good stuff. So I'm standing like this in line, waiting my turn, and there's a very large white woman standing next to me, and a small African guy next to her, in between us, and he's got a cesta, he's got a basket, it's obviously her criado, her mpishi, her cook. I'm standing there, and she says, "Temos cebolas." And I think, so I turned to her, I said, "É uma portuguesa." She gives me a withering look. And she says, "No, who are you?" So I said, I'm Ned Alpers. I've just come to teach at the university. That was like Saturday. The next day, we're in our flat at the university. Bop, 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 bop on the front door, and I opened up. It's Eduardo Mondlane. This was Camarada Jeanette Mondlane. That's how I met Eduardo. And it gives you a good idea of how powerful everybody's intelligence network was. He'd already figured out that he'd gotten information that I wasn't a CIA agent. Well, it's like somebody asked me, what did you have to do to get clearance to go work in the archives in Lisbon in 1964? I had to go to the American Embassy to get a letter, not to say that I was a legitimate scholar, but to say I was an American citizen and wasn't on some communist list or something like that. So it was very political. Mm-hmm. But anyway, Eduardo had checked with other people. Of course, I knew who he was. I sort of opened the door. Oh! And then we became friends because we had a lot in common because we were both academics, but also because I was interested in Mozambique, and so we talked a lot about the history of Mozambique. I was telling Felipe, one of the things I had was this. I have a note. I think it's in my papers that I gave to UCLA. Eduardo was telling me people I should see who knew about northern Mozambique and things, and I have it written in his handwriting. Lázaro Cavandame. Well, Cavandame becomes one of the Antichrist figures for Frelimo. We would say a Baixo Cavandame. So it was very much not formed yet in their ideology. But you met everybody. I mean, got to know. None of them. The people. There was one person in particular I knew really well, got to know really well, who had kind of an unhappy history within Frelimo, a guy named Lorenzo Mutaka, but I got to Cisano and Marcelino and these guys, and they all, every time you'd show up, Marcelino especially, amazing memory. I mean, I must have been 15 years between times I'd seen him, like once or twice. And I went to see him with Alan and Bobby Isaacman, I think he was still vice president. And I walk in, and Alan, they knew each other really well. And he said this. I said, I remember Alpers. These are smart guys. So that was, and then I met ANC people and SWAPO people. I mean, everything was going on there. So you couldn't not, unless you were against it or just so academic, it just wasn't a place to be separated. And even the scientists and things, they might not be political, but I remember one guy who was a professor of chemistry, and I thought, what is a white professor of chemistry from England, I think, do? He was the child of missionaries. So for him, being in Africa had a different, but so everybody had that was a thing. Everybody had a reason to be there. And that was exciting. And then the Arusha Declaration took place, and Ujamaa and all the struggles at the university over trying to create a common course which was appropriate so that graduates went out and served the people, which caused a huge revolt from the students. Nyerere came to campus after the students had sort of, they didn't strike exactly, but it was a big demonstration against this. And he came out, it was packed house, I remember. I was sitting next to John Saul, and I still have notes. I had one of these big foolscap pieces of paper, and I'd folded it up many times, and so I would write my notes, and I've looked at it sometime since, and I have to open it in just the right way to be able to read what I wrote. But it was, Nyerere was a very powerful figure, intellectually very big, and his charisma was really something. So everything, went on like that. And then every black nationalist came through there. Stokely Carmichael came through and was dressed down by Walter Rodney for being basically a racist. Stokely was brilliant speaking. These big churches, he would speak to the students, then he'd lower his voice, and then he'd bring it up again, and he was talking about the white faculty. And Terry Ranger actually spoke and said, Terry'd been thrown out of Rhodesia because he was a member of the African National Party. But Walter stood up and just took Carmichael down on a theoretical basis that, the revolution will not happen this way. And he was a Marxist, and Stokely wasn't. Stokely was just, at that point in particular, was basically a straightforward black nationalist. But that's what was going on all the time. Dar was like that. It was, and there were countermeasures. When I went back in 1972-3 to work in the field, I gave a big seminar. Been published called Rethinking African Economic History. It's kind of a neo-Marxian semi-development of underdevelopment, Gunther Frank and things of that sort, but a little more Marxian than Gunther Frank in some ways. Anyway, I'm giving this paper to a joint history, political science, economics seminar, 50, 60 people, and I end. An American asks me this question, very economistic and theoretical question. Now, I'm not trained in economics, so my economics was Marxian and learned, as political economy. And I stopped for a second, and suddenly a voice comes up. And I knew he was Guyanese because he sounded just like Walter Rockaby. And he was a black man, very good. And he absolutely destroys this question. And I just kept my mouth shut. And it turned out to be Clive Thomas, C.Y. Thomas, who's one of the great Marxists, and became Walter's political ally in the Working People's Alliance in Guyana. So I've always told my students, I said, when you're giving a paper, when you finish giving it, you will always be asked, at least for a job interview, you will always be asked at least one really stupid question. And the way you deal with that is you say, it's a very interesting question. And then you try to... And the other thing is you'll sometimes be asked something you don't know about. And because academics love to hear themselves talk.
Yes.
What you should do is like waiting when the light changes in the intersection, you wait a beat, so before the crazy teenager or somebody drives through. I said, wait a minute. That's what I did, because I didn't know the answer. And this great answer comes out from Clive. So, and then we became good, Clive and I, we became good friends. But that night, that evening, it turned out, my wife and I had been invited to a party at the U.S. Embassy. I had no idea, but I was back. I guess I was unknown when we were invited. Oh no, that was actually in the 60s. So that was not this same story, but somebody from the United States, a political scientist, had come and was basically defending American policy in Vietnam. He was an African, but taught at Georgetown or American University, one of these places with a lot of State Department. And we had a division of labor. This is also how it goes back to picketing Woolworths. And so if an Italian came and saved us, the Italians who were there would attack him. So I was one of the attack dogs for this guy. So we were pretty critical because, Vietnam, this wasn't even the worst days of Vietnam, but it was, from an African perspective, this is crazy. So that night we'd been invited, so I recently, maybe 2 or 3 months in Tanzania, we get invited to the embassy for the first time. I'm off talking to some guys, and Annie, who is pregnant with our first child, big time pregnant, so it was late in the fall. She's talking to some embassy wives. There's a special category for embassy wives. And they say, who are you, and who are you, dear? She says, I'm Annie Alpers, and my husband teaches at the university. I said, oh, I understand your husband had some interesting things to say today. Because they had their own network of people who were reporting back on kind of so everything was political. There was no way you could open your mouth and not have somebody either, report back saying, he's okay, or he's, and so that also, and obviously during Vietnam it was very much against the war, and so when we were back for that second time and we're living up country, I would come down to the embassy, or just to come down and see people and shop, and I met somebody from the embassy. He said, "Oh, we have a soft." He said, "We have. I think we'd pick a basketball game or softball. Why don't you come and play with us?" And I said, "No, thank you," because all they want to do is to pick your, ask you questions about what was going on, because where we were living in Morogoro, which is about 200 kilometers inland, was right near the major ANC military training camp, and I was friends with those guys. And it was, again, an interesting thing. My best friend there was a man named Joe Lanla. We weren't great friends, but we knew each other from the first time I was there. we used to play tennis at the local, what used to be the King George V Club, now the People's Club, on these clay courts with about 5 kinds of ants that would crawl up your ankles. And we'd play with John Sender, who was a development economist and a South African. We'd play tennis, we'd talk about tennis, we'd talk about Tanzanian politics and world politics. We never talked about South Africa. And Joe knew that I knew that there was a military thing, and I knew that Joe knew that I knew. You know, nobody says a word about that. You're just careful. So it's you learn a lot. So by that time, I was a little more sophisticated and understood all of these things. But Dar was just this. I owe a lot to those 2 years in Dar es Salaam because they formed me. And then when we went back to Los Angeles, so this is 68. And, everything's happened. There's anti-war stuff, and then I knew all the leaders of Frelimo, so I became very engaged in the liberation support movement, the Frelimo Liberation Support. I was very involved in the Los Angeles premiere of Robert Van Leerop's A Lutte Continua, the film. Mm-hmm. Bob was a really interesting African-American filmmaker. So he'd come out, he was a New Yorker, but he would come out, and there would be a whole group of us, and we organized, and that was interesting because it wasn't just academics. It was with activists who were also, fighting the police over other things. And, you'd go to these meetings. So there would always be somebody who stood up so we're talking about what the strategy should be for not for Frelimo, but how we should publicize things in Cuba. Somebody would stand up and say, I represent the Socialist Workers' Party. These are Trotskyites. I have a lot of respect for some aspects of Trotsky, but then there was like a 15-minute talk about this, and everybody would roll their eyes. And you knew that in the audience there were probably 2 or 3 Los Angeles police officers who were undercover agents posing as members of the CP, Communist Party or something. And that too, and these meetings were almost always down in South Central Los Angeles, which was the heart of Black Los Angeles. So I would go, we'd have dinner with our daughter wasn't, she was born in 1970, so leave my family in Pacific Palisades, which is very much an upper middle class neighborhood, drive down to South Central at night and spend 2 or 3 hours down there. I never would have gotten to see that part of Black Los Angeles if I hadn't been politically engaged. And the other thing about that was interesting is there would always be some, cultural nationalists who would stand up and argue against this. But then some of the black folks I knew were Marxists or serious leftists. And they'd stand up and... So again, I didn't have to do anything. Just let them fight that out among themselves. Mm-hmm. Because I wasn't going to get in the middle of that one. I'm a loser to begin with. But it was really exciting. And of course, with independence, that kept on with South Africa. So I actually got to meet Nelson Mandela in Los Angeles because he was a student in urban planning, but he was an ANC heavy. It was interesting. UCLA, most of the South Africans, the main South African had been a student and then became what's called a student affairs officer, like a counselor for underrepresented students. And he was a PAC adherent, Pan-African Congress, much more to culture. So we got along well, and I actually got to know him quite well because when I was undergraduate dean, he was still so we had an interesting relationship. But this other fellow was an ANC person, so we, again, there was stuff organizing, and you always coordinating with New York and the American Committee on Africa, which was run by Jennifer Davis, who was an expatriate South African, and really a wonderful person. and they had, there was a Mandela Village at the UCLA, and when there was a Mandela Village, this must have been 92. Oh, it's when when UCLA was when the University of California was considering divesting from South Africa, and any businesses that did, that invested in South Africa. So they had a Mandela Village right in the center of the campus, right in front of the administrative building. There's a big quadrangle. And it was funny because the last time there'd been something like that was during Vietnam, so none of these kids knew what they were doing. And but one of my colleagues at UCLA was Mzizi Kunene, he's dead now, but was the greatest living Zulu poet. Taught Zulu and African literature at UCLA. So we go around and talk about doing this. So again, it really didn't end until, and then Mandela came to UCLA, and we went to City Hall. We took him to City Hall. He met the mayor, came outside, spoke from City Hall, on the side of City Hall. It's the first time I ever saw a signing, and it reminded me and the funeral things, did you see the famous thing when they, during Zuma's presidency, when they had the big memorial for Mandela in the stadium, and they had this guy signing, and he was doing his, we knew he wasn't signing, and it turned out that he was somebody's cousin and was being, but I remember that at Mandela's they had two signers, and I thought, oh, look at that, for, it was the first time I'd ever seen that done at a public event. And then we went over to the Los Angeles Coliseum. It seats 95,000 people. We got to go backstage, and so that was all quite incredible. But after 94, I'm a little older, we're doing different things, and so I'd say that from that period on, my activism was mainly giving money to organizations that I think deserve it. There are some people, like I guess Bernie Sanders and some others, who either because they're politicians or because that's been their whole life. But it's difficult to maintain that level of political engagement and get your work done.
Yeah,
it is. So definitely. You have to make some kind of a decision, and I think it was just a process of maturation and getting older, and supporting students, and always did things like that. And I was also kind of played out my politics in the department by supporting my women colleagues, and was undergraduate dean for 11 years. So I did a lot of things that I thought would help undergraduates get. So you do things in different ways. You shape your career differently. But as your first questions, this is where I went, and African history was absolutely central to it. One of the nice things, and actually not stuff. I guess I have some in the Mozambique's in Brazil piece, but I've done several things. One of which should have been published about 3 years ago, but one of these volumes where they never get around. So I'm about to pull it finally after 5 years or 6 years. But I've done stuff on African music in the Indian Ocean diaspora, because that's one of the surefire ways of finding Africans, or spirit possession or dance or something. So, but in particular, the work I've done in Mauritius has a lot of that has been around African origin music, and Malagasy too. And so I realized at some point when I was working in Mauritius, doing, again, never extended field, always short field work, and working in libraries, working with music. And I've really just come full cycle back to rock and roll, my rock roots, And of course, world music had become I have all these tapes I got from the first time I was in South Africa, getting Bakanga music and everything, because I love that stuff. And it's great to dance to. But I realized that I was basically, if I'd stayed doing American stuff, I would be studying African American music, if as a historian. And I was always interested methodologically in not just studying, making the point. Historians love songs because they have texts. So you can read the words.
Yes.
And you just treat it like, like this.
Yes.
Yes.
But there's the music and the rhythm, and how do you analyze the rhythm, and the dance movements and everything. And because that, that tells you what you, and since our son's a professional drummer, I could get help sometimes with the more obscure, but basically all Southern African music is 6/8 time. You can get that, and you can hear it in Sega, you can hear it in Maloya, you can hear it in any kind of South African or Zimbabwean music or Tanzania, whatever. And then, dance movements will be different. They all have, and that was just fun again, and then coming out of administration, coming back to being a full-time historian. Lots of fun.
Oh, that's great. Ivana,
you have a question?
Eu tenho uma pergunta. Você falou um pouco do movimento pelos direitos civis nos Estados Unidos, e no Brasil a gente costuma, por muito tempo, muitos historiadores pensaram essa relação, uma espécie de história comparada entre o que acontece, como foi o desenvolvimento das relações raciais nos Estados Unidos e no Brasil. Né? Então, a doutrina dos separados porém iguais, aqui no Brasil nunca existiu. O que existiu aqui foi uma coisa que hoje nós chamamos de mito. Né? Mas durante muito tempo foi uma formulação teórica, e até hoje é apropriada por alguns movimentos, uma formulação teórica que pressupõe uma democracia racial. Nós não temos nenhuma legislação que separe brancos e negros, mas de alguma maneira as relações raciais no Brasil e nos Estados Unidos no século XXI me parecem muito semelhantes. E acho que no caso brasileiro, os estudos africanos foram, a institucionalização dos estudos africanos foram uma demanda dos movimentos negros organizados, né, que compreenderam a máxima de que conhecimento é poder, né, que é preciso estudar a África para fortalecer o movimento negro brasileiro, que luta com esse fantasma, né, porque se formalmente nós não somos uma sociedade separada, na prática isso não acontece. Nos Estados Unidos me parece que é um pouco diferente. Os estudos africanos precedem os movimentos de direitos civis ou não? Precedem, tem outros objetivos, talvez, né? Como é o caso dos estudos africanos na França, na Inglaterra, na Bélgica.
But these three societies have a lot in common, and there are several books like Fredrickson's book on South Africa and the Racine Society or something in the United States and South Africa, George Fredrickson. And there's one book I can't remember, a long time ago, on Brazil and the United States. What's interesting about them, especially in terms of the teaching of African history, is that the different ways in which the Academy discovered African history and started researching it and teaching it, and then what impact that has or has not had in the teaching of African history at the level, like at middle school, where you're teaching, or in high school. And so, the United States, the reason, and it goes back to your original question, the reason I'm an Africanist is really the civil rights movement. It's the miasma, that I grew up in. And so out of that came interests in black history, and then in African history. And of course there had always been people, like W.E.B. Du Bois, the world, there had always been people who looked to Africa, and movements that did, but they were, like black music, which used to be called race music before rock and roll. If you went down to Harlem in New York to sort of, very bad to do, dangerous neighborhood or something. So the civil rights movement is what pushed the United States towards this. And of course we did have a colonial, like the Philippines, and things. So it's not that there's no colonialism outside of and of course we had lots of colonialism within the United States, but there was nothing like France or England or Portugal where there were still colonies in the 20th century. So the United States started moving in that direction, and eventually, all the struggles over, and every state, by the way, there's no federal control over the content of education. It's first at the state level, so that's 50 states, and then at the school district level. So you can live in one part of, depends on your state. If it's more local control, they can be teaching black history in Little Rock, and you're in Conway, Arkansas.
Oh.
And they're not doing it. So it's the United States is much less centralized than most non-Americans realize. Brazil is, I know Brazil's very federal, but and compared to England or France, I mean, it's totally different. But the United States starts that. So then, if you look at the two different trajectories, they're in South Africa. It's the gradual movement towards releasing Mandela and the first democratic elections. And since then, and I remember when the first time I went to South Africa and the second, I was both times in the 90s, I'm at some conferences. So one was a history workshop conference. I met a lot of really smart people, really interesting people engaged in publication and feminists, all sorts of, but who also were really committed to changing the schools, not least for white students, and they were mostly white. So how you teach, the new South African history was a big thing. In Brazil, it was It was 1988, and the new constitution that changed things. That now, the struggle isn't over. But I think as long as there's however it thinks of itself. In this case, it was a military dictatorship. In South Africa, it was a racial, but they were basically the same. They didn't have much interest in indigenous peoples or the non-white subjects. And I can't say that the United States, as a society as a whole, cares much about people of color. But there's so many. They can't, they have to deal with it in some way. And everybody says, "Oh, well, you had Obama." Yeah, we had a black president, even if he was born in, So I think there are a lot of things. There are a lot of comparisons, and then a lot of them, the organizations. That was the wonderful thing about the Museu Afro Brazil. All those newspapers, to see all the organizations that black folks did long before they had much in the way of rights, and it's there's an I've thought of this. They wanted to be. Some people wanted to, in a sense, to recreate Africa, kind of thing that Walter Hawthorne has written about, and now Joaquesh has written. More of this, but many people just wanted to become middle-class Brazilians, whatever their color was. So all those newspapers, and this is like Brado Africano in Mozambique. This is the Associação. What is it? Associação dos Negros de Mozambique or something. But they were all, almost all mestizos. It was interesting because Brado Africano actually, after I think the first, maybe not at the very beginning, but they would have columns in Chironga.
Yes, I've seen that.
Which was really interesting, because it said, well, somebody's literate in Chironga, but also, I haven't been to Luanda, but people say, everybody just speaks Portuguese. But in Maputo, people speak Chironga and Portuguese. You go to a football game or something, they're all speaking Chironga. Those kinds of, and then you look at, of course, the American tradition. There's a long tradition of literacy, and there's people like there's this one of my Christmas books, and is David Blight's got this incredible new biography of Frederick Douglass. She's spent 10 years writing, and it's really, I mean, I've just dipped into it now. It's quite extraordinary. But, there's a huge literature by all kinds of people now. And, eventually that will happen here, too. But I think all of these things sort of go at their own pace and they have their own dynamics. But if you're looking for parallels, I mean, I think you could do, I know you could do, and some people do lots of parallels between organizations in that period. Not that they necessarily knew about each other. There's some degree, who was it? Coletso Atkins at Minnesota did this wonderful book called something, what is it? The Moon is Down or something. It's about Zulu workers in Natal having to adjust from Zulu time to mine owners' time, and the adjustments that this all involved. And she did a short piece in the, what was it? It's the African Studies newsletter. I mean, the ASA News, whatever it was called. It was not as fancy as it is now. On black sailors in the Atlantic in the 19th century. And they carried news, pretty much every ship had at least one African on it. And so, the revolution in Haiti, in Saint Domingue takes place, and pretty soon there's black sailors all over the Atlantic telling everybody else, you get to Sao Paulo, or you get to, Salvador, or to Rio, or wherever, or, Windhoek, who knows where. Yeah. And you start talking, and so there's a whole informal network. So what I don't know is to what extent these kinds of implications that something's happening somewhere else. I think, in fact, that in general, this is, not like Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, and I understand he's just won this huge Norwegian prize with hundreds of thousands of dollars at the totally ignoring the South Atlantic. But the point is that black folk were in touch with each other, I think, and had some sense that something's going on there. That they weren't in some areas, like rural Mississippi, they wouldn't know about this. But the emerging intelligentsia, bourgeois, and that, to move to the Indian Ocean, to me that's one of the interesting things about the Indian Ocean, that there is no W.E.B. Du Bois, Douglass doesn't count because he was born a slave, but there were no black self-conscious intellectuals at the same time that it's going on in the Atlantic. So the awareness of being an African didn't really exist. I know for the CDs, in many cases, people were not really thinking about how CDs were connected to Africa until people like us came along and said, "You're African."
You are, yes.
And some of the CDs that I know said yes. And in fact, I sent a Swahili grammar to one guy. I hope he got it. I never heard back from him. But there are other CDs I know of. There have been videos who said, "No, I'm absolutely clearly of African, genetically African." No problem. He said, "No." I said, "I'm Indian. I speak Gujarati." I said, "I'm not." And of course, they were in that case. They're interesting. They're not in the caste system, but they're also not indigenous people. So India has a vast bureaucracy for naming, for getting rights, and for affirmative action. So some of the CDs in Western India have said, "No, we don't want to be." It's what's called scheduled tribes. So all of the non-Hindu, the Aparadasi, the indigenous people, they all get this because they're tribals. But in some cases, some of the CDs have actually applied for and gotten recognized as a scheduled tribe. So it's, so there are all these different ways in which local versions of the same, from outside, say that these are all people of African descent, but they're very different. And they're mostly Muslims, but they're the ones who escaped from Goa are Catholic. Some of the Siddhis are Hindu. Now, you have to ask yourself about that, because you have to be born a Hindu. But these were men who escaped, and they obviously married Hindu women. And became Hindu. Their children become Hindu. So so the Indian Ocean was really interesting, because there were so many. That's the other thing, is how do you ask yourself new questions when you're an older, whatever you're. So here I've been studying the ivory trade and the slave trade. I didn't take the ivory trade any further, and it's interesting then the people like Jeremy Prestholt and now Pedro Machado, their emphasis, they say, well, Alpers and others and Sharif have studied the slave trade, the ivory trade as a commodity going out. What did Africans want out of this? And so Prestholt's work on 19th century Zanzibar and Machado's work on Mozambique really are looking at how did African, and that's where agency comes in, how did African tastes, because I remember I had a line in my talk about this, how did African tastes affect what they were getting? It's not, it used to be said that Europeans just gave trinkets to you.
Yes.
Not true. If you give the wrong trinket, nobody's going to sell you anything. So you had to know what the market was, and people were very specific. In terms of textiles, from the work I've done in Mogadishu, I know the Germans tried to copy certain kinds of American cloths, and Somalis would smell it, and the dyes smelled different. And I said, "No, we don't want this," And of course, it's like picking up a book, and get that nice smell of the fresh pages. So on the slave trade, I'd always been looking. I was always looking at the demand, and I've always told students, I said, look, whatever you think about the ethics of the slave trade and the immorality of it, if you want to study the slave trade, you have to look at it first and foremost as an economic phenomenon. There's no slave trade without a demand for labor. It's not. It becomes about morals and ethics, but it's about labor. And so that was what I'd been interested in. And then somebody asked me, it was, a conference in Sweden in 1997. And I was asked if I could do something on Africans in the Northwest Indian Ocean. And that's the long piece that I published. The first time I really looked, I thought, right. Whether or not you call it, whether you call it a diaspora, because diaspora has all kinds of meanings. But it's the first time I had read through all of this stuff about African communities in Arabia, and Pakistan, and India, and then later I did all this work on Mauritius, and I thought, right, of course, those Africans, they're there. They're more absorbed into local societies in some ways, but they're also different. So in Arabia, for example, people were all get manumitted and everything, but they're still black. And there's I have another piece coming out. It's come out now in a book that Africa World Press just published. And it's about the way in which Africans have gained recognition in the diaspora politically. So it's called From Bilal, the first muezzin of Islam, who was an Ethiopian slave, Muhammad, prophet, free, to Barack, because Obama was president. So it's about the history of blacks in Arabia, the history of blacks in South Asia, and this was right after the Ferguson shootings in the United States. So it was, and it's the only time I've ever used not use the internet. I'll use it all the time, but use blogs. Look to blogs to get some information because I was looking at contemporary things and started reading these Saudi blogs in English that are about. I Google black Saudis or something like that, or Africans in Saudi Arabia. And these guys said it was fascinating. They said, "Oh, my family has been. We're originally from the Horn of Africa. My family's been here 3 generations now, and they still don't regard us as Saudis." Or they'd say, "Oh yeah, there's a lot of racism here," and every time you mention it, they point to Bilal. They said Bilal was black, and that solves everything. So it's a little bit like the politics of Saudi now. So we really like the crown prince, but he seems to kill his opponents. So it's so that was fascinating. And then of course it turns out that there's wonderful material for Mecca in the 19th century that a Dutch anthropologist did. And those pictures I showed. And there's music, and there was czar possession, and so that just took, it just kept on going. And in some cases, then people have picked this up. There's a wonderful young French historian named Clara Boyer-Rousseau. Mm-hmm. And Clara,
I knew her.
She's wonderful. She's a sweetie. We're old friends. The first time I met her, it was one of the nicest things that had happened to me. She was so excited to meet me because she said, "Look, here's this paper I've done," and like 9 of the references were to my work because I'm the only person who had looked at the Mozambique Channel slave trade and looking at Makua, and
in Madagascar.
And I'd mined her dissertations. Fantastic. She's actually also combined an activist. She got there, and Makua are really not regarded as Malagasy. For one thing, they can't get buried in the same cemeteries. Their graves aren't allowed to turn in the same direction. There's all kinds of stuff. I mean, they speak Malagasy now. Mm-hmm. But so she became really involved in helping them to organize local festivals and things like that. So she's continuing to do this work. But it was somebody. She'd been working with people in Paris who knew me, but had also been doing work. Noël Garnier, who's a linguist, an anthropologist, who'd done work on Makua vocabulary in Madagascar. And so new people pick up and they do the work. And then some of my students have, Matt Hopper has done this wonderful work on Africans in Eastern Arabia, and Benaj Mirzai, I've worked with, what was a student of Lovejoy's at York. It's this very good book, prize winning, I think, on slavery in Qajar, Iran, and abolition. And, she's a Canadian, but she's an Iranian Canadian, so she did. I said when I first met her, I said, if you hadn't gotten interested in this, we would have had to invent you, because what Africanist is going to learn Farsi? Is going to learn Persian? What's the point? But if you know Persian, you can use it. so it's not like learning Portuguese or French or English or something like that, which has broader things. So.
Posso emendar uma questão nessa? E como é que você vê a história global atualmente e qual seria o lugar da África nesse contexto? Você fala de dinâmicas distintas, atlânticas e índicas, né? Ou seja, é como se fossem universos que têm dinâmicas muito separadas e muito distintas, não separadas. E essa é uma questão. Outra questão que eu fico querendo perguntar para você, você falou de SOAS em London, não é? Onde tem Richard Gray, Walter Rodney, David Birmingham, Oliver, Terry Branger, right. Yes, and you. Right? O outro foco é Wisconsin, com Vancina, com Curtin, com Miller, com Mary Carrish.
Yeah, Mary Carrish, exactly. Yes.
Isaacman, né? São orientações distintas, ou seja, Indian Ocean here in SOAS and Atlantic world?
No. I think the distinction was more methodological. I mean, when you think about it, who else from SOAS really worked in the only other person is Abdul Sharif. Abdul actually did his undergraduate in geography at UCLA, at UCLA, and his MA in African Studies, and then he took some time off and taught, and then went to SOAS. So he's a SOAS PhD. So,
I love him.
Abdul's a sweetheart. He's a wonderful man. There's actually, I'll just say, apropos of interviews, the book I just co-edited in India with Chaya Goswami, which is called Trans-Regional Trade and Traders. It's Oxford University Press, Delhi. The last section is on diasporas, Gujarati. It's Gujarat in 2,000 years of Gujarati history in the Indian Ocean. And Abdul has done basically a personal essay on what it means to be a Zanzibari, because when he first went to India, he said people would say, "Oh, you're Indian." He said, "No, I'm not Indian." He said, "I'm Zanzibari," and he's very adamant about what his. And he grew up speaking Swahili. He's learned some Gujarati, but it really tells you about him. We were so happy we got him to write that particular piece rather than just another piece from Abdul. So I don't think it was that. I just think that if working in coastal East Africa, even look at all the archaeologists who do this. I mean that's one of the reasons why Indian Ocean historiography is weighted towards the Western Indian Ocean, because Michael Pearson, who's big history of the Indian Ocean, was sort of the text, not really a text, but before my book on the Indian Ocean. He used to complain about that, and he was an Indianist, and Indianists all think, India comes down and then it divides the Indian Ocean. But he had a reason to say, Africanists need to spend more time looking at other things in the Indian Ocean. And I've written about a phrase that Richard Allen has repeated more often than I ever have. I wrote something that talked about the tyranny of the Atlantic Ocean, if you're looking at slave trade studies. Yes. And then Richard uses this. And now Richard's book on slavery in the Indian Ocean, which European slavery in the Ocean, 1500 to 1800, talks about Saint Helena and everything. So there really is a movement. And I had done that thing on the French slave trade in East Africa that I did. There's a short period of about 6 or 7 years where French slavers are coming from Mauritius and taking slaves to Saint-Domingue just before the revolution.
And actually, before the Brazilian.
Yes, and some of them were also taken to Novo Orleans because there's some Makua in the 18th century censuses. In the sense that what's her name?
The historian, the woman.
Yeah.
Middle Hall.
Yes, Middle Hall. She's an interesting character herself, married to a black communist labor organizer.
Oh, yeah.
And she's amazing. She's about 85 now or something. So, but for the most part, obviously, people didn't do that. And there are also interesting connections between Mauritia and Brazil. Freemason connections.
Masons. We say Masons.
So there are all sorts of interesting things, and ships would go from there, from Mozambique to Mauritia to Rio. But anyway, so I think the big difference was that if you wanted, Curtin was, once the Atlantic slave trade census came out, that was sort of that and Time on the Cross, which were the two big early quantifying things. They did this with big computers. But the real reason to go to Wisconsin was because you wanted to learn about oral tradition. And Vancina had I got an English translation. I first bought De la Tradition Orale, which was 61. I think I'd read it in college. Whereas SOAS was just, I said there are two kinds of dissertations at SOAS. One was trade and trade in politics, trade in conflict, trade in something, state.
Pre-colonial trade.
Yes, yeah. In Angola, or Walter's history of the Upper Guinea Coast might as well be trade and conflict, and my dissertation had a different title, but it was the same thing because that's what Europeans wrote about. The other thing was the missionary factor in Yoruba land, Gold Coast, wherever, because missionary sources. So it was much more a traditional historiography in which there was no attention paid to ethnography. You sort of talked about it at your peril, sort of. Not really, but, you didn't bother to. And you did it on your own. So the kind of work I did, to take an article like Trade, State, and Society Among the Yao, which I published in 1969, I got a letter from an anthropologist in New Mexico. She said, this is the best thing I've read about matrilineality. And I thought, okay. And I said, thank you to my one semester teacher at Harvard. But we basically had to learn that for ourselves. So I think that was the big difference. And to give you an example of that, one of my dearest friends is Andrew Roberts, who was eventually, I guess he was professor of African history. So Roland retired, Richard became professor. He retired, or I didn't. And then Andrew became. And Andrew is a Brit. He went to Westminster School. He went to Cambridge. He served in Ghana. He did his national service in Ghana at the time of independence. Mm-hmm. And then he went to Wisconsin to study with Jan van Sina, and then wrote a history of the Bemba, political history of the Bemba, which is based on field work. And then we met because he was that was the other thing we had. He had a 2-year Rockefeller Fellowship as a Rockefeller Fellow in Oral History in Tanzania. So we both went out from London at the same time. He was already finished at SOAS at Wisconsin. So the big difference, I think, was that. The other thing, in terms of in the United States, let's say from UCLA or Northwestern, but UCLA, big rival with Wisconsin. UCLA, at one point, my colleague Bill Werger did a census of all the faculty who held tenure-track jobs in the United States teaching African history. 15% were produced by Wisconsin, 15% were produced by us at UCLA, and then other, smaller amounts of it. And, there's actually, that leaves a lot, but still, we were the big producers. And the difference was that Terry Ranger, for the 5 years he was there, he always had an agenda. He wanted people to work on this aspect of Shona history or that aspect of nationalist history or this sort of missionary history.
And religious also.
And, but the rest of us didn't. So, for people who do early African history using linguistic sources, my colleague Chris Errett, really Van Sina was the only other one who did it. And Chris actually, as a graduate student at Northwestern, used to go to Wisconsin to take seminars with Van Sina. They don't agree. They didn't agree about everything. But Chris then trained other people. And those people have now trained other people. So that, but he never made people do it. He would just do a seminar on, language evidence for the history of South Africa. Some people would take it and say, well, that's interesting. I learned a little bit about the methodology. And somebody said, that's kind of interesting. Let me take a second one. And that's how he got students. And I just said, you need to figure out what interests you, and then I'll work with you. And that's kind of why today's seminar, it was a challenge, and we were operating in 2 languages, why it was a familiar exercise for me. Mm-hmm. Because I never expected to know. I can't remember if I said it here, but when I started working on northern Mozambique, and Richard Gray handed me, he said, do you feel about learning Portuguese? I'd started to learn German. I said, sure. I had French. I said, sure, why not? So he reaches into his library and hands me, those green International African Institute ethnographic surveys of Africa. he hands me Mary Two's survey of the matrilineal people of East Central Africa. Mary Two becomes Mary Douglas, a Puritan Jane Trudeau. She was something. And I talked to her once about this because they weren't interested in having us go study with her. But that's how I got introduced to northern Mozambique, matrilineal peoples of East Central Africa, Yao, Makonde, Makua, and that's why I continued to define the region I work in. And a region is East Central Africa. It goes right to the Luapula River. It's all matrilineal to the Bemba. And then it kind of runs out as you get into southern Tanzania. But that was it. And then I started reading Alexandre Lubatu and Teixeira Butelho and all the other, the colonial. And Lubatu was Teixeira Butelho was pretty good, but Lubatu was a terrific scholar, really terrific scholar. I mean, Teixeira, very narrow, kind of political and military. But important because he gives you a chronology of the. And then, of course, and Jim Duffy had written some stuff, and Charles Boxer was my external examiner, so I kind of was aware of that stuff. But Lubatu is really a remarkable scholar. And do you know that Yusuf Wadam, his table, his study, was Lubatu's table. Yeah, so that's something that he has from. And Banyan de Andrade did those Relações de Moçambique Setecentista, and Carvalho Dias has a volume of some of them are the same, but other. So there was published primary material. Anyway, I start working with this and, working with the Portuguese, and I was scheduled to do one of these weekly seminars in the spring term, in my first year. And I went to Richard and said, Richard, I'm just making my way through this. Can you help me with this? And he said something, the most powerful thing you could say, which I said to all of my students. He said, well, Ned, you know more than I do. I can help you do the structure of the history, but you know more than I do. And I thought for a second, damn, he's right. I do know more than I do. He didn't know any of that literature. I knew more about northern Mozambique than probably anybody, any historian on the face of the earth at that moment. And that was incredibly empowering. So I went and gave my paper, and I think it might have become Trade, State, and Society. It probably did, actually, or a version of it. But then they really worked you. So I come back from the archives in Lisbon and Paris in 1966, when I'm getting this whisper about UCLA. And Roland says later, or Richards says, well, we're having this conference on chronology, and we'd like you to do a paper on the chronology of the Wenu-Wetapa states. That's the thing that... And I said, what? I said, I have to finish writing my thesis. I've got it was March, so what, March, April, May, June. I'm going out to Tanzania in July. I had 4 months to write. Sat down, read all of that stuff, and could use the Portuguese sources, and wrote that crazy paper. Gave it at the conference. It's very useful, because like a lot of things, you get to pull stuff together. Yeah. And then went to it was the first academic conference I'd been to. Really the only time I met Vancina, and I met him, I was walking by, and he's sliding down the banister of the stairway. You know what a banister is? The handrail. Slide, yeah. That's how I met him. You'll appreciate this story too. It was it was an international conference, and it was bilingual. But Roland spoke fluent French, really fluent French, and he opens the conference with a very elegant statement in French, saying, "Yes, we're francophone and anglophone, but we, so that we can move ahead. Let's do this in English." One of the conference participants was Robert Cornavin. And Cornavin was a Gaullist, and a real Gaullist. And he said, "Mais non, mais I have to." So everything had to have a translator. So one of the people who gave a paper was Donald Abraham, a truly crazy scholar. So D.P. Abraham gives this paper about the legenda of this princesa, and it's a typical Abraham thing. All kinds of oral traditions kind of mixed up together and not... He goes on and on and on, and finally finishes. Vancina is the lingua. And he says, "En bref, Monsieur Abraham a dit que," and goes on for about 30 seconds. That was it. It was such a put down. He didn't have to say, "This guy doesn't know how to use oral tradition," but that was it. So those are my two experiences of Vancina. And then, the only time I went to Wisconsin was for a Walter Rodney conference after he was assassinated sometime. And I know all those guys. I mean, they're my age mates. But I never really knew Vancina. I didn't have any reason to. He may have been possibly one of my referees, but I don't know, do I? So I think that was the interesting question. The last question that you have is a really major. Once you ask that in Portuguese,
actually, it's missing a sentence, so it doesn't make sense for me.
Well, it does to me about north and south.
Yes, I'm gonna add Davi's questions.
Mm-hmm.
Bom, em português.
Tchau.
A gente pensa, a gente até comentou hoje no workshop, o Davi especificamente, sobre essa questão da restituição, né, das peças africanas para os países africanos e como que a Bélgica está lidando com isso, e a Alemanha e mesmo Portugal, né, e Inglaterra. E daí o que eu queria saber um pouco eu queria ouvir um pouco do senhor falando se esse tipo de preocupação, né, a descolonização epistêmica e essa postura ética que a gente precisa ter perante essa demanda africana, se não me engano, talvez pode ter sido anterior, mas acho que começou com Mandela reclamando a Sarah Baartman. Se também não é o momento da gente estar pensando na sobrevivência dos arquivos africanos, entendeu? Porque cada vez mais a gente tem esse fluxo de não africanos para a África, que digitalizam parte do acervo ou um fundo completo, né, dependendo se for alguma coisa institucional, e que daí traz duas consequências. As pessoas, então, no futuro vão menos à África para buscar as suas fontes, em que medida isso impacta, por exemplo, um mestrado, um doutorado, uma primeira grande pesquisa, e em que medida também, assim, pensar um pouco também no impacto mais pragmático, né? Com os europeus, os americanos deixando de ir à África, a sobrevivência financeira desses arquivos, né? Por exemplo, a gente sabe que a cópia mais cara e tal é muito do que do apoio financeiro. A gente sabe que é sempre a crise é alguma coisa constante, mas de alguma forma eles vão manejando sobreviver. Não seria alguma coisa, um tiro no pé, a gente pensar em digitalizar sem pensar em como fortalecer e consolidar esses arquivos africanos, independente dos fundos que nós consigamos trazer para as nossas próprias faculdades fora da África?
Well, this is like the question about the Elgin marbles, in the British Museum, that the Greeks are trying to get back now. No, it's one of the key questions of the field as a whole, and sort of the responsibility of scholars and of and of countries. So, I mean, there's some things, when you make interesting decisions, what do you do individually? So, rather than, I'll talk about it generally, but just to give you my own experiences. So my wife and I have a good collection of Makonde sculpture, which we bought mostly, some from Mozambique, mostly in Dar es Salaam in the 60s, and mostly from an Ismaili dealer who was a very nice man, became a good friend, who would go in southern Tanzania, collect this stuff which coming across the border, some of it, and then other things, and so. What are we going to do with it? I mean, now some of it's still we still have in our collect at home. It's interesting. Our local museum, the UCLA museum, isn't interested. It's sort of not. They haven't figured out yet. They have some modern African art, and they have, older African artifacts. Mm-hmm. They haven't quite figured out what to do with some other things. Part of me would like to give that to Mozambique, but I know that things are not well taken care of in Mozambique, that things disappear, that things could just as easily show up in the black market later, so I'm just going to hold on to that. On the other hand, Alan Isaacman gave his collection, his big collection on Lusophone Africa, mainly on Zambezi and the southern Africa, to the University of Western Cape. He actually has an appointment, it's a special appointment there. I think it's called, illustrious, it's some crazy title that sort of, it's a special thing. So he goes when they go to South Africa every year. He goes and teaches, just sort of like this, but a little more. So he gave his whole collection. And they've got a separate section. This is, you haven't been to Western Cape. If there's a big Malangatana mural in the front of it, and I have a signed Malangatana.
Really?
He was I knew him. Great guy. Anyway, Alan's collection is there, but typically, and this is a problem. One shipment. It wasn't a thing, but one reasonably sized shipment of books didn't get there. They just disappeared. And there are many horror stories of people sending books to Africa. Somebody told me once they got off the airplane in Katanga.
Yeah.
And there were like two crates, two big shipping crates of books that he had sent like 3 years before. But nobody, so you have to have
About Katanga?
Yeah, they were all, he was somebody, a scholar, they hadn't done this. So African Studies Association has a small grant program where I think you can apply for up to $3,000. But there has to be somebody, you have to have documentation of somebody at the other end who will actually see it gets into the library. And then you just have to, cross your fingers and hope that the stuff stays there. And I know for Tanzania, Steve Fireman told me once that he was he'd sent some books from his first work and stuff. And then he went back and he was working in the library at the University of Dar es Salaam. And he said the books were just sitting in the loading dock. They'd come in and nobody had done anything with them. So this is a problem. So anyway, Alan contacted me and he said, look, I sent these books, but some of them are, there's holes in what I sent. If I send you the list of all the books I sent, could you fill in? I said, sure, because I'm trying to get, like everybody I'm trying to get books somewhere that they'll have a longer life of use. So he sent me this, and I had some of them, and then many of the things I had he had already duplicated, or he'd sent. But I realized that my collection was focused on northern Mozambique, and Alan actually didn't have any of that stuff. So I put together 10 boxes, is what are called bankers boxes, of books to send, and they're going to be part of that collection. Now, why University of Western Cape? We're still waiting because the South Africans want to charge as much as they can on customs. So we sent an initial, they sent 10 books to see what would happen. And I think they're still waiting, but UWC has got an excellent professional library staff. They are, real, as good as anywhere. And Paulo Israel is there. I don't know whether he'll stay there forever, but there's somebody who works in Mozambique there, and generally in Lusophone Africa, and it's a good library. And this is going to be a library that books can't be taken out of unless they're stolen. Carefully. So I thought, I'm going to give them there and of course, UEM has a fair amount of stuff. You never know what there is. But so I've sent my books there. They haven't gotten there yet, but they'll get there eventually. And I felt, I did take, when I was going through my library, I went through everything with the UCLA catalog in front of me, online, and they tended to have most of it. Where they didn't have things, I gave them specific things. But most of my strange, and this included a lot of East African, Tanzanian ephemera. That's what big library has, all the main stuff. So, but most of the other stuff, they actually had a lot of Portuguese stuff. Because I would say to our Africana librarian, gee, can you find this, or can you buy this? Or she's Nigerian, she's fantastic. So I said, let me give it to an African university. And so that's one way you can give back. And the other way is through your professional associations, you can push for things to be done. So through the African Studies Association, there's been, over the years, much more focus on giving stuff back to Africa. We now have this program that it combines with Fulbright monies that the ASA has raised to bring maybe 7 or 8 or 12 African scholars over to attend the ASA, and then through the Secretariat we contact people at other universities, so they'll go to Boston or New York or whatever the meeting is, and then they'll have another maybe 2 weeks where they can go out and speak at other universities, and somebody else will pay for them, will host them. So they have a basic fare paid. The ASA waives their registration fees and everything, and they get to meet a lot of people. And then the American Historical, other associations do this. I think and then there are things like ALUCA. Do you know about ALUCA? ALUCA is a Ford Foundation program that Isaacman was very big in getting started. I was involved in some of the first meetings, but they basically digitize stuff. So, for example, all the South African ANC materials, all of a Revolução Moçambicana, the whole that I have a complete set of that myself, but it's all digitized. So as African universities in Africa gets more and more internet on and all of that stuff is made free to those universities. So there's actually been a fair amount. The bigger thing would be, should archival sources go back, and first of all, European countries all say no, because they'll say we created, if they think about it, we created these. But also, it's hard enough to maintain archives.
It is.
Anyway, it was this last 2 times I was in Maputo, it was so great to work in that big go-down. But it's not the best place, everything should be air-conditioned and climate-controlled, and there's that little room in the back where the Brazilian-trained technologists are working on, one document at a time. But it's much better. You never worked in the old archive. So the old archive was in the basement, or the rez de chão, of a prédio, right up from the Mercado Central, and the road on the left, the Mercado, is up there, almost to, what is it, Lumumba, is it, that's back there, or Cohen, to the big... And you'd go in, and they'd have, copies of Arquivo, the magazine, and you'd go in, and they would have Lubatu's 19th century, the files we all use for the 19th century. They're still good, but I mean, they're a little confusing. And then you'd ask for something, and Sopa was the one.
Yes.
Sopa would go back, and the thing is, it was a prédio, so there were like 6 floors of apartments above them, with sewage pipes coming down and everything, and we were all just petrified that one day it was all going to fall apart and the archives would be ruined. And it's a very rich archive.
Yeah.
I mean, not like Angola, but for Mozambique, it's incredible. And especially the 19th century stuff, I think. But I've used the 20th century stuff, too, for Islam. And then it was a funny place. So I remember there was a guy from Zambia who was doing some work using newspapers. So he was getting stuff photocopied, which was an advance over the old days. So I was working on the old PD files on Islam from the 1930s. So I said, I need to have this photocopy. What is it going to cost me? And it was like it was very expensive. So I asked my Zambian colleague, I said, what are you paying for that? And they were charging 3 times as much to photocopy these. So I said, I went to whoever it wasn't Sopa, it was one of the, Major. I said, what's the situation? He said, these are secret documents, secret files. I said, they're Portuguese secret documents. They're not Mozambican secret documents. They're secret police documents. I said, this is Patrimonio Nacional. I said, it's better. And also, there's not going to be any flooding up there. It's big and airy. I mean, I think that the reading room is, when the sun is right, it's terrible. The sun comes in on top of you. But all of those files, they wanted pictures. I went back, we stood by Tete, the file for Tete or something like that. And they take good care of the building. I mean, I noticed there were women constantly dusting and sweeping, so they're doing the best they can.
Yes.
But, but the famous arquivo that was going to be built at the university at Independence now está lá. So.
Mas os arquivos portugueses vivem uma situação parecida e contrária, né? Porque os prédios são maravilhosos, mas a documentação do século XVI está apodrecendo e os arquivos passam por uma grande crise. Não há dinheiro para restaurar.
Right.
O arquivo do Arquivo Histórico Ultramarino, completamente desorganizado, um catálogo super então te dão as caixas, né? Você pega as caixas.
Mesmo edifício. ainda. No, I was talking to who was I talking to? Carlos or somebody. And he said, no, it's the same thing. He said, you ask for something and hope that what you're looking for is in it. And the big difference is that the Portuguese have organized and in some cases digitized things from the Antiga Concedida Ultramarina até 1833. Depois, so there's hand lists and everything. You can't. So you just have to go in and dig. And there's caixas e maços, códices, and all kinds of stuff. And so it's got to be one of the most phenomenal archives in Europe, but it's still not organized. It's not like not like the British Library or the archive, the National Archives in Kew.
Muita coisa do século XVI para Moçambique, fora de circulação, que é impossível manipular. Como sabe, a datação é tão avançado, nos fotos mais
Mas nosso arquivo do Poder Judiciário de São Paulo, onde estavam todos os processos criminais de 1900, 1930, ficava aqui do lado do rio. E toda a época de cheia, entendeu? A água entrava no arquivo e os papéis viravam pedra. Né? E os funcionários entravam de barco no arquivo e tentando botar para cima esse material. Então, uma parte da documentação, e isso São Paulo, que é o estado mais rico, né? Toda a documentação, né? Vai virando pedra por conta das enchentes e do contato com a água.
No, and the other thing that would on, you get a that's true in Maputo. You're not working in the 19th century, but you go to Maputo and they'll bring you anything, and then you open it up, and there are white ant holes and everything. You don't have to use gloves, and you don't want to use gloves either, because it's. But so you hope that you can turn it and that you're not destroying it any more than it's already. So, I mean, they are helpful, and this is one of the things that it was also interesting. I should be careful here. Daniel and I both got letters from João. The director.
Joel.
Yeah, Tim. But when it came to Daniel actually doing a lot of photography, because it does say, there's a sign that says no photograph. You take out your iPhone. They're okay. But he was just, because he's got pressure from the top. He's just the head of the archive. There was a period where Daniel finally said, if you don't give us the go-ahead, even though we have these letters that you gave us, but if you don't call and tell the person at the archive, he said, I'm not going to be able to finish this because we've got 8-9 registers to do and other things. And he'd already done, I've got some photographs of Daniel standing around showing the staff how you do it. And he's very fast. And finally, Charles said, okay, I'll you can go ahead and do it. And he got everything, and of course, what's good then? It's like the Portuguese did this. I mean, the Portuguese have photocopied a lot of, microfilmed a lot of stuff and sent it back. So there's, bit by bit things.
These are almost, the microfilms are almost destroyed.
Oh, really?
Because it's too hot.
Too hot. Okay.
And then the o microfilme começa a vinagrar.
This is an interesting thing. I was the African Studies Association, the Librarians Association of African Studies, has their own sub-professional group, and they meet twice a year at the ASA once and once at one of the libraries, and they have 2 elected positions of non-librarians. So Ruby Belgam asked me if I'd stand for election one time. This is after I'd been president of the African Studies Association. So I said, sure, so I served 2 terms. So I served 4 years working with librarians. Actually, then I recommended John Thornton for it afterwards, because I said, if anybody knows about this, John. But what was really interesting is they were having big debates. So what they would do is get recommendations for, the Sierra Leone Advertiser from 1819 to 1829 or something, which nobody in the United States had or hadn't been done in England. And there were interesting debates then. Maybe they're not having the same debates now. Somebody would say, I think we should digitize them. And they would say, no, we need to microfiche. And why? Because nobody was at that point sure what was happening to the internet. Stuff might disappear. And microfiche was seen, as seen as being a more permanent thing. Well, in the United States, it might be. It would take 50, 60 years to disintegrate. Now, I think people are secure enough about at least the longevity of the internet, that digitization is what people do. And, when you take photographs and get them on your computer, you can expand them, you can read things.
It's much easier.
It's much easier, yeah. It's still something that's interesting to work with, especially a big document, to have the document right in front of you and to be able to get down there and do it. It's different from the screen is still between you and but some things are more legible, especially like side notes. But anyway, I think I agree. I mean, how could one not that it's important. First of all, unless South Africa and Nigeria and Kenya can figure out how to actually run their economies, it's going to be a very long time before any African country is in a position to compete academically and source-wise with Europe and now the Gulf. I mean, the Gulf states, the money they have is unbelievable, and they're doing a lot of stuff. But I think it's incumbent upon, ministries of culture and all of this kind of stuff to get as much stuff that can be reliably moved and maintained. And the main thing is because you could say, okay, not everybody in Lesotho can get to this, but it's never going to get lost or stolen or something. And so somebody, for the most part, that's true. I mean, European archives, the National Archives in the United States are really well preserved, and people can get access to them. But if you can make that some of the most critical things available digitally, and then they can go to one of the to the capital or sign on. And most people aren't going to want to do that anyway. It's for the scholars. So it's and training, of course. That's the other thing. Is there are more and more African universities that are training people, and they're training some very good people. There's a lot of not so good stuff too, but I think that's probably like here too. You have the same sense of training.
Então, vamos terminar por aqui. Foi uma longa conversa e sobre aspectos muito importantes a respeito da sua trajetória e da tua trajetória e conhecimento com essas figuras, né, que são, de alguma forma, a base do nosso conhecimento de história da África. Então, é muito bom ouvir você falar de Eduardo Mondlane, de Samora Machel, ou de Jean Vancina, ou de Terry Branger, né, que são, de alguma forma, a base do nosso conhecimento de história da África, principalmente história da África pré-colonial. Então, queria agradecer muitíssimo a tua presença e os teus ensinamentos. Juliana, queria se despedir também?
Queria agradecer novamente, acho que foi um dia incrível. Vou demorar um tempo para absorver tudo isso, mas obrigada.
Nós
Obrigada mesmo.
Obrigadinhos ela também, porque é muito interessante para olhar ao longe da minha carreira. It's very interesting to do this, and I've done it 2 or 3 times now, and each, tell stories and then they fit together in interesting ways, and so I really appreciate the opportunity.
Mas foi um prazer falar de história da África sempre.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it.
Essa coisa da paixão, né? A paixão por isso que faz. E aí nem parece trabalho, não é?
Pois, não, exatamente.
E o que eu achei incrível, assim, é a vida correndo junto com a história da África, né? Eu acho que é isso que é, né? Isso que é maravilhoso, que é fascinante, né? É como se todas as coisas acontecessem, porque tiveram que acontecer, né? Um pouco essa ideia. Muito obrigado e foi um prazer.